A single phrase, "touch her and you die," has sold more than 10 million books. This isn't a love story. It's a blueprint for a viral obsession where fictional mob bosses and billionaires don't fall in love, they claim. And an entire generation of readers is secretly yearning to be owned. This is the dark romance genre, a multi-billion-dollar literary phenomenon born in the algorithmic heart of TikTok. Its core audience, primarily young women, and the central fantasy isn't a prince, but a predator who sees her as his ultimate prize. So why, in an era of female empowerment, are stories of violent obsession and possessive claim dominating the bestseller lists? The answer lies in a single, viral platform that rewired how we fantasize. Welcome to Book Talk, not a bookstore but a digital realm where literature is consumed in dizzying 10-second slideshows. A single page highlighted with dramatic text set to trending audio. A quote like, "If he touches you, I'll unzip him from throat to navel," isn't just read, it's felt, shared, and craved by millions in an instant. This algorithmic engine found its perfect fuel in dark romance. The genre wasn't new. Its roots stretch back to the bodice rippers of the 1970s, where brute force was often mistaken for passion. But the internet, and specifically TikTok, removed the gatekeepers. No publisher's marketing budget could compete with the raw, viral magnetism of a morally gray hero claiming his obsession. The platform, For You page became a fortune teller, learning that users who lingered on a clip about a Mafia don's violent devotion would voraciously consume more. The algorithm learned our secret desires faster than we could admit them to ourselves, and it began building an empire. Enter the authors, women like H.D. Carlton, Rena Kent, and S.J. Tilley. Many were indie writers publishing directly to Amazon. They weren't writing for critics, they were writing for the algorithm and the readers it delivered. They mastered the tropes, the innocent, often traumatized heroine, the hyper-competent, lethally possessive hero from a world of crime. The central, irresistible promise: his darkness isn't for everyone, it's only for her. The numbers are staggering. The hashtag Dark Romance has over 8 billion views. Mafia Romance surpasses 4 billion. A single viral review could catapult a book from obscurity to the top of the Amazon charts in 48 hours, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. This wasn't just popularity, it was a paradigm shift in publishing power. But what is the actual fantasy? It's not about a good man. Psychologists and literary analysts point to a craving for unambiguous devotion. In a complicated, often impersonal world, the fantasy is a man whose priorities are brutally simple. You, above his business, above the law, above his own moral code. His claim is absolute, a shelter forged from violence. The hero isn't asking, he's declaring, he's stalking. He's eliminating threats with surgical precision. And for the reader safe in their own bed, this translates as the ultimate form of security. The world is chaotic, but in his orbit, she is the central, immutable law. This is where the first major fracture appears, because these stories frequently play in the gray areas of consent. Scenes that depict abduction, confinement, or what the community euphemistically calls non-con are not just subplots. They are often central to the power dynamic and the eventual, twisted redemption. Readers defend it as fantasy, a safe exploration of taboo. Critics call it the romanticization of abuse. The comments on viral videos tell both sides. "I need a man who looks at me like I'm his entire universe," sits directly above "This is genuinely concerning and glorifies trauma." The machine, however, is indifferent to the debate. It only sees engagement, and engagement was skyrocketing. By 2022, dark romance wasn't a subgenre, it was the genre. Traditional publishers scrambled to catch up, signing book talk sensations to 7-figure deals. The tropes hardened into a formula as predictable and as potent as a chemical reaction. But below the surface of this billion-dollar fantasy factory, a real-world tension was building. The very algorithm that birthed the trend was about to turn on it. Because when you train a system on obsession, it doesn't know where to stop. The line between fictional dark romance and dangerous real-world ideology is perilously thin, and the first major breach was closer than anyone thought. It began with the comments. Under viral edits for Haunting Adeline Asterisk, a dark romance about a woman stalked by a hacker, readers didn't just fantasize. Some began to relate. Comments like "I wish I had a Zaid" were interspersed with others saying, "This is literally my life right now, and my ex did this. It's not romantic, it's terrifying." The book's hero, Zaid, is a vigilante who stalks, kidnaps, and assaults the heroine, Adeline, all framed within a narrative of ultimate obsessive love. For most, it was a thrilling fiction. For others, the line blurred. The algorithm, designed to maximize engagement, couldn't distinguish between "this is hot" and "this is my trauma." It served the content to both. Then the discourse exploded. Literary commentators and psychologists began dissecting the trend on the very same platform. Videos analyzing the potential harm of romanticizing stalking and non-consent garnered millions of views themselves, creating a meta-war on BookTok. The community fractured into dark romance enjoyers and concerned critics, often attacking each other in comment sections. The fantasy was now a battlefield. Authors found themselves on the front lines. H.D. Carlton, the author of Haunting Adeline Asterisk, included trigger warnings and defended her work as fiction for consenting adults. But the sheer scale amplified the backlash. The book became a symbol, cited in mainstream news articles about BookTok's dangerous side. The very mechanics that made it a success, the addictive, shareable snippets of extreme content, now made it a target. This was the first major consequence. The backlash loop. The more controversial a book became, the more it was discussed. The more it was discussed, the more the algorithm promoted it, drawing in curious newcomers and outraged critics alike. Sales soared even higher. Haunting Adeline sold over 1 million copies in this environment. The system had become a perpetual motion machine of provocation and profit. But the real world began to push back. School libraries and parent groups started compiling lists of BookTok books to ban, with dark romance titles at the top. The debate moved from online comments to school board meetings. The fantasy of a mafia boss claiming his woman was now clashing with the reality of what material was accessible to teenagers. Retailers faced pressure. For a time, Amazon's algorithm would recommend Haunting Adeline Asterisk to readers of young adult romance. After media scrutiny, such connections were quietly adjusted. The free marketing engine of BookTok now came with a reputational cost that corporations began to calculate. Meanwhile, within the genre, an internal pressure cooker was building. To stand out in an increasingly crowded field, authors began pushing boundaries further. If possessive mafiosos were mainstream, what was next? The tropes splintered into ever darker niches: monster romance, bully romance, mafia romance, where the heroine was the villain. The competition for the algorithm's favor created a race to the bottom of the moral scale. This is where the second fracture appeared, between the authors and the readers. Some readers began to report burnout. The constant exposure to high-intensity trauma and possessive dynamics was becoming emotionally exhausting. The fantasy of being claimed was giving way to a numbness. The shocks were no longer shocking. Yet the machine demanded more. Aspiring authors watched the trend maps, studying which tropes were hot each month. They weren't writing from passion but from data. This led to a flood of copycat stories with identical beats: a weak heroine, an instant obsession, a violent external threat, a possessive claim. The unique, twisted heart of the early dark romance stories was being replaced by a sterile, algorithmic formula. And then the money got serious. Traditional publishers, once skeptical, now saw the numbers. They started offering life-changing, multi-book deals to BookTok indie authors. But with that money came pressure to sanitize, to make the darkest elements more palatable for wider bookstore distribution. This created a creative dissonance. The very content that made these authors viral was now being softened by corporate editors. The authentic, gritty appeal of the indie dark romance was at risk of being homogenized. The trend also began to leak into other media. The success of the Asterisk 365 Days Asterisk movie adaptation on Netflix, another controversial possessive romance, proved the audience existed beyond books. Suddenly, film and TV producers were optioning book talk titles at a frantic pace. The fantasy was escaping its literary confines, destined for the mainstream screen with all its problematic baggage intact. But the most significant escalation was yet to come. It wasn't about sales or censorship or creative integrity. It was about the readers themselves. As the genre saturated the market, mental health professionals and researchers began asking an urgent, uncomfortable question. What is the long-term effect of consuming hundreds of stories where love is modeled as obsession, where consent is ambiguous, and where violence is the primary language of devotion? Early studies into parasocial relationships and media influence suggested that heavy, repeated consumption of any narrative can shape expectations. The dark romance community had always had a shield. It's just a fantasy. But when that fantasy is consumed daily, for years, by a primarily young and impressionable audience, does the shield begin to crack? The algorithm, the authors, and the publishers were about to face their most formidable opponent, the psychological reality of the very readers they had created. Personal stories began to surface, quietly at first, in support groups and therapy forums. Women, often in their late teens and early 20s, shared a disturbing pattern. After deep immersion in dark romance, their perception of real relationships had shifted. Jealousy was mistaken for passion. Controlling behavior was interpreted as deep care. The fantasy's logic, that extreme acts prove ultimate love, had seeped into their real-world expectations, making them more vulnerable to toxic partners. Therapists specializing in media influence started noting the trend. Dr. Amanda R., a clinical psychologist, reported in an interview that she was seeing clients who, after consuming vast amounts of this content, expressed disappointment that their real-life partners weren't more possessive or obsessed with them. The fantasy framework was creating a benchmark that reality could not and should not meet. Simultaneously, a counter-movement was brewing within book talk itself. A cohort of readers and creators began the dark romance accountability trend. They made videos not just critiquing the books, but meticulously analyzing their tropes against real-world abuse tactics. They created charts comparing fictional love to real-world red flags. This wasn't an outside attack. It was a civil war within the community, fueled by readers who loved the genre but feared its unexamined impact. This internal pressure forced a new evolution. A subgenre emerged, often called dark romance with consent or monster romance with communication. Authors like Lily Mayne, who writes popular monster romances, wove clear, ongoing consent into their fantastical narratives. The market was segmenting. One side pushed deeper into taboo, the other attempted to ethically reconcile the fantasy. The algorithm, confused, promoted both. Then came the legal and platform repercussions. In late 2023, TikTok quietly adjusted its recommendation algorithms in several countries. Content with certain graphic keywords or depicting simulated violence for romantic purposes was demonetized, and its reach limited. The free marketing machine had a new governor. Authors and book influencers had to pivot, using more suggestive language and censored visuals to avoid the shadow ban. Amazon's Kindle Direct publishing platform faced its own reckoning. While it allowed immense creative freedom, it began more rigorously enforcing its content guidelines against offensive material. Several dark romance novels were abruptly removed without explanation, causing panic and outrage among authors who depended on the platform. The digital bookstore was no longer a lawless frontier. The financial stakes were now astronomically high, and this created the genre's most sinister escalation, the rise of the content farms. Recognizing the profitable formula, some anonymous publishers began using AI and ghostwriters to mass-produce dark romance novels. These were not stories of passion, but products engineered from viral trope lists. They flooded the market, diluting the genre further and squeezing out genuine indie authors. The fantasy of being claimed was now being generated by soulless algorithms, sold back to the readers whose data trained them. But the true "it gets worse" moment arrived from an unexpected direction: the world of real organized crime. Cultural commentators and journalists from Italy began publishing exposes on how the global mafia romance trend was actively annoying and angering real anti-mafia activists. The fantasy of the noble, devoted mobster was a direct insult to the memories of thousands of victims of real criminal violence. The romanticized version wasn't just harmless, it was a whitewashing of brutality. This critique struck a profound chord. It moved the conversation beyond "is this bad for women?" to "is this bad for society?" The genre was accused of perpetuating the very same myth that real mafiosi cultivate, that they are men of honor, bound by loyalty and family, rather than perpetrators of extortion, murder, and human suffering. The backlash reached a fever pitch in early 2024. Major literary publications that had once ignored the genre now published scathing condemnations. The word "problematic" was replaced with "harmful." The shield of fantasy was cracking under the weight of real-world analogies. In response, a siege mentality took hold among the genre's most devoted defenders. Online spaces became echo chambers of increasing polarization. To question a trope was to be labeled a prude or a hater. This defensive posture stifled meaningful dialogue and pushed the community further from the mainstream. And then, the ultimate consequence for the creators: burnout and backlash became personal. Top authors reported receiving death threats from both sides, from critics who called them propagandists for abuse, and from unhinged fans who demanded ever more extreme content and harassed them when they took creative breaks. The fantasy factory had become a pressure cooker for the very people who built it. The machine was now visibly straining. It had scaled a fantasy into a global industry, weaponized an algorithm, ignited a culture war, and now faced external regulation and internal collapse. The central question was no longer "why is this popular?" but "what now?" The genre stood at a precipice. It could crash under the weight of its own contradictions, or it could transform. The next move would not come from an algorithm or a publisher's boardroom. It would have to come from within the heart of the fantasy itself. This internal revolution took a practical form. Seasoned readers began creating detailed trope maps and content guides, not just for thrills but for safety. They used the community's own language to highlight where a story crossed from dark fantasy into glorification, creating a new layer of critical engagement. The conversation shifted from "is this allowed?" to "is this done well?" Authors responded. A new wave of dark romance emerged, one that maintained the intensity and possessive themes, but with a crucial ingredient previously often absent: explicit, ongoing character agency and consent. These stories explored power dynamics with a self-awareness that the early, raw iterations lacked. The fantasy of being claimed was now often paired with the heroine actively negotiating the terms of that claim. Publishing platforms, seeing the commercial sustainability of this more nuanced approach, began to support it. Amazon created clearer content labeling systems. TikTok's algorithm, while still promoting dramatic clips, began to also boost the thoughtful analysis videos, creating a more balanced ecosystem. The market was maturing. The genre also began to look outward. Some authors partnered with organizations that support real-world victims of stalking and domestic violence, donating proceeds and including resources in their books. This wasn't an apology for the fantasy, but an acknowledgement of the real-world context it existed within. It was a bridge between the fictional obsession and tangible social responsibility. The most profound change was in the readers themselves. The community fracture between enjoyers and critics slowly healed into a more sophisticated, discerning readership. Readers could love a dark, possessive hero while also dissecting his toxic traits. They developed a literacy in the genre's codes, allowing them to engage with the fantasy critically without breaking the spell entirely. This was the ultimate defense against harm, an educated, self-aware consumer. The legacy of the dark romance boom is now etched into the foundations of modern publishing. It proved definitively that power in the industry had irrevocably shifted to readers and algorithmic platforms. It forced traditional publishing to speed up, to listen to grassroots demand, and to take digital communities seriously. The book talk book is now a permanent, powerful category in every bookstore. Culturally, the genre sparked a long overdue mainstream conversation about the nature of fantasy, female desire, and where the line is between exploration and endorsement. It challenged simplistic notions that women should only fantasize about nice things. It made the complexity of female desire a topic of public debate, however messy that debate became. And here is the final, surprising detail. Recent academic research into the phenomenon has revealed a paradox. While case studies showed the potential for individual harm, broader sociological surveys suggest that the collective, community experience of discussing these books has, for many, increased media literacy. The constant debate over consent, power, and tropes has turned a massive cohort of readers into critical analysts of narrative itself. The genre that was accused of dulling critical thought may have, in the end, sharpened it. The fantasy of being claimed, of a dangerous, all-consuming devotion, remains, but it is no longer an unexamined daydream. It is a fantasy now viewed in the high-definition light of its own consequences. It is a story that has been claimed, in turn, by the millions of readers who shaped it, readers who demanded that even their darkest escapes be built with a door they control. The storm has not passed, but the ship has been rebuilt to weather it. The algorithm continues to scroll, the books continue to sell, but the conversation has changed forever. And that conversation is the true, lasting claim. It reveals a profound truth about the digital age. We are no longer just consumers of culture. We are its architects, its accelerants, and its critics all at once. A fantasy, once private, can now be scaled into a global force in a matter of weeks, complete with its own economy, its own wars, and its own path to maturity. The story of the possessive romance trope is a blueprint for the future of storytelling. It demonstrates that the audience holds ultimate power, but also ultimate responsibility. The question left hanging is not whether these fantasies are valid. They are. The question is, what do we do with the power to make them ubiquitous? How do we nurture spaces where dangerous fiction can be safely explored without spilling over into normalizing real danger? The journey from a whispered, "what if?" to a billion-dollar industry and back to a critical conversation is the defining cultural loop of our time. It happened with dark romance. It will happen with the next fantasy and the next. We are all, in a way, writing the story now. The algorithm is listening. What fantasy will you claim next? If you want to dive deeper into the stories that shape our hidden desires, make sure to subscribe. Let us know in the comments what other viral phenomena you want us to dissect. Thanks for watching.